Ladies and gentlemen, kia ora from New Zealand. I'm delighted to tell you about deep technology in Europe today. Let me share my screen with you to give you my presentation. This picture really characterizes the situation we find ourselves in at this time. It is evolution that took 4 billion years to produce humans characterized by Rodin's penseur here. But now we have design, and the complexity of the design that we can now produce is beginning to rival what evolution has managed to produce. So deep technology is really an interesting addition to evolutionary technologies. And deep technology in Europe is what I want to tell you about today. My talk is in 4 parts. I will talk a little bit about the relationship between the United States, the EU, and China. Then concentrate on technology sovereignty as one of the iconic problems of our decade. It's probably one of the most important issues to resolve in this decade together with climate change. Then I will describe 4 key technologies which I believe are going to change our lives within the next 5 to 10 years, so they're worth examining in a little more detail. And last but not least, I will talk about the European Innovation Council, which will produce 10 billion euros for deep technology in Europe and addresses some of the issues I will touch on in this talk. So let us start comparing the US, China, and Europe. The US characterized by Google's headquarters here on the top left, China, the most amazing growth rate of any nation ever in the history of mankind, and Europe at crossroads in the way. It falls to Europe to decide on whether we want to be the Europe of the Roman Colosseum and looking backwards in history, or whether we want to be the Europe of the NAP laboratory that you see here in the Cambridge Science Park, whether we want to look forward to new technologies and be an equal to the US and China. In the next 3 slides, they really characterize where the 3 big elephants in the world are. America clearly is dominating the world of finance with 8 out of the 10 most valuable companies in the world. So that's really the iconic slide that sums up the US position in the world. This is the slide that characterizes China, because China has had the most phenomenal growth of any nation ever in the history of mankind. And you see here this exponential growth, which is only gradually flattening. And here is Europe's dilemma, that although China is now by far the largest economy measured by purchasing power parity, the EU, interestingly, is number 2, and the US is number 3. But if you ask people, who is the world's leading economic power, 42% will say the US, 32% China, and only 9% Europe. So there's never been an economic area that has punched so far below its weight than Europe, and we must do something about this. In addition to this perception that the world has of Europe lagging far behind the US and China, we now have a serious problem with technology sovereignty. Because as the coronavirus pandemic has shown, we've become dependent on China when it comes to manufacturing masks and PPE and many other technologies. And we've become dependent on the US in some high technology fields, especially the dependency on some monopoly providers from the US like Google, Apple, Facebook, Netflix, Amazon. And we've also witnessed President Trump using some of these, weaponizing some of these technologies to coerce countries, including his allies in Europe, to do his bidding. So 2020 really was a big wake-up call for Europe because of these two important events. These have shown that one-sided economic dependencies lead to this economic coercion that is now possible and is being exercised, that is just as effective as military coercion of yesteryear. So we all have to ask ourselves three questions to avoid economic dependence. One, do we have the technology ourselves? Two, if not, do we have access to it from multiple independent countries? And if still not, do we have unfettered, long-term, greater than 5 years, guaranteed access to it from monopolies or oligopolies from a single country, typically China or the US? If the answer to all three questions is no, we have to do whatever it takes to ensure that the answer to one of the questions is yes. Because if we don't, we become dependent on another state and we get exposed to economic coercion, which we've witnessed in recent years. So let me now talk about 4 key innovations that I believe are going to change our lives within the next 5 to 10 years. And let me start with one of the most exciting ones for a physicist like myself, which is quantum computing. Talk about AI and machine learning next, synthetic biology, and blockchain and smart contracts. Quantum computing is a new technology that physicists have been dreaming about for many years, as we've been dreaming about fusion. We always thought it was 30 years away, and fusion is still 30 years away, it seems, but quantum computing is not. The expectation is that we will have quantum computers that will achieve quantum advantage, things that quantum computers can do that classical computers cannot do within the next 5 to 10 years. So quantum computing is really just round the corner. The basic building block of a quantum computer are qubits, quantum bits. And the interesting, phenomenal performance that quantum computers can achieve has to do with the fact that the performance of a quantum computer rises exponentially with the number of qubits. Whereas if you increase the number of normal bits in a classical computer, the performance only rises linearly with the number of bits. So this exponential increase in performance can crack our RSA 2048 codes, for example, which is a major event because most of the encryption that is being used by companies is the RSA encryption mechanism. And if we do indeed have quantum computers within the next 5 to 10 years, then anything that you encrypt at the moment with that RSA code will be in clear text to be read by anybody in 5 to 10 years' time. The other thing that quantum computers can do better than any classical computers, as Richard Feynman pointed out many years ago, is to simulate quantum systems. He rightly said, why would you want to simulate a quantum system with a classical computer? The right way to simulate and model and understand a quantum system, like molecules, like the way molecules interact with each other in a biological context, should be done by a quantum computer. So one of the great hopes for quantum computing is that it will allow us to develop drugs much more efficiently and faster than has been possible hitherto. Europe has had a lead in quantum computing, but it's disappearing fast because both America and China are putting much more money into their quantum computing startups than Europe has. A good example of that is the SPAC that has just given IonQ, a US ion-based quantum computer company, 650 million. This is an early stage company with no revenue, but America is willing to put substantial amounts, 650 million, behind a single company to try and take the lead in the world in quantum computing. Western teams are sort of tens of people, maybe a small number of hundreds, but Wei Pan, who actually was educated in Innsbruck, got his PhD under Zeilinger, has a very close relationship with Austria, runs a group in Beijing now, which has 1,000 people working on quantum issues. So the amount of money and manpower that both the US and China are putting behind quantum computing completely dwarfs our European effort. So we've got to up our game in quantum computing and design these quantum systems. AI and machine learning. Again, the US and China are ahead of Europe, but I'm delighted to report to you that one of our investments, GraphCore, has now produced the highest performance AI processor in the world. So there is a chance, and GraphCore has also managed to raise 750 million for a startup in Europe, which is rare. So there are exceptions where sometimes we manage to get enough money behind these companies to be able to play on a global scale. But in order to really succeed in AI, we've got to have access to big data. And big data at the moment is owned by GAFA, by Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, etc. So GDPR, which is a European standard, helps with letting people own their data, which is the only sensible way of dealing with large data. And we've got to have the right regulations in Europe to fight these American monopolies. If one thinks about who should own data, which is clearly the people, but then how you use it for the benefit of society, the best criteria we have come up with is that you've got to look at the purpose that the data is used for. So if it's just used for advertising, then clearly if Google and Facebook make all the money with it, some of that money ought to flow back into to people who actually provide the data. When it comes to health, clearly it is beneficial to have anonymized health data to help us develop drugs and improve the health system through data that we share amongst ourselves to improve our health system. If these companies get too big, and many of the American monopolies are, then we need to help break them up. And I think Europe ought to do its part to break up Google, Amazon, Facebook, Netflix, and the other monopolies or would-be monopolies. The third one is synthetic biology. I've chosen synthetic biology because it is really a technology that allows us to understand biology at the most basic level, which is at the basic building block level of biology, which is the genes. So if we can synthesize genes, and again, we've got an investment company, another Cambridge company called Evonetics, that is solving the problem of assembling smaller parts of DNA into longer genes and maybe even complete chromosomes, will allow us to put these building blocks of biology together to build new systems. And a very good way of thinking about the synthetic biology is described in a book called Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark. He calls it Life 3.0 because Life 1.0 is the nematode worm, where both the hardware and the software are determined by evolution. Life 2.0 is us, where the hardware, our bodies, are still completely defined by biology, but the software, our behavior, is learned. We speak a particular language because our parents taught us this language. We behave in a particular way because society has taught us how to behave. Synthetic biology also will revolutionize chemistry, because many of the chemical processes can be substituted by fermentation, which is much more efficient energy-wise, proceeds normally at room temperature or close to it, and has much less harsh conditions than normal chemistry processes. But it needs level-headed regulation. A good example is the Embryonic Research Council in the UK, which has produced a very rational way of dealing with touchy issues of embryonic research. But it basically enables us to design biology. And that, of course, is very exciting and potentially very beneficial for mankind. Blockchain and smart contracts, or distributed ledger technology, has a very bad name because of the volatility of Bitcoin and many fraudulent initial coin offerings. They've tainted the technology. But once we solve the KYC, know your customer, and AML, anti-money laundering technologies, I think DLT technology, distributed ledger technology, will become mainstream, because they can completely restructure and make the global payment system much more efficient than it has been in the past. And China again has the lead by introducing their own central bank digital currency, but I hope Europe and America would follow suit. Real estate might also be revolutionized by blockchain and smart contracts, because you could have partial ownership of interesting buildings that you see. Insurance is another area that will be revolutionized by DLT technology, but good regulation is needed. The great promise of blockchain and smart contracts is that we can automate business processes and therefore make our society much more efficient and increase productivity. I now come to the last part of my talk, which is to introduce the European Innovation Council to you, which is being launched on the 18th of March. It is 10 billion euros for deep technology in Europe. Can I remind you that the US has 5 times more venture capital than the EU, and China has even more government money for deep tech. So it is high on time that Europe raises its game and puts a significant amount of money, $10 billion euros behind deep technology. Because the European Innovation Council was set up to crowd in a venture market, and if you look at the figures at the moment, for every $1 that the EIC puts into companies, we get an average of $3 to $5 from the market. This is an initiative which is really a $30 to $50 billion initiative, which can make quite a difference to European technology over the next 7 years. It is divided into 2 paths, a 4 billion euro Pathfinder grant part and a 6 billion euro accelerator, which is equity or blended finance together with grants. So more than 50% of the equity money always has to come from the market. And the EIC, of course, has a very close relationship with the ERC, the European Research Council, which is 20 billion of Horizon Europe, which is the overarching R&D program for Europe, which is 100 billion over the next 7 years. In conclusion, Europe must have technology sovereignty. We need to do whatever it takes to get out from under the dependence that has sneaked up on us, the dependence on the US and China. This is particularly true for 4 new technologies: quantum computing, AI, synthetic biology, and blockchain, where the game has not been lost yet. And we must make sure that we are one of the 3 areas in the world that have a chance of becoming technologically sovereign. And that's, of course, the US, China, and Europe. In order to achieve that, we have started the European Innovation Council, which is 10 billion euros for deep tech in Europe, which together with the market will hopefully be a $30 to $50 billion capital availability for European deep tech. The role of government must not be underestimated, because we need the right framework, we need the right regulations, and to be a catalyst to make this work for Europe. Thank you very much.